The avoidance withdrawal after causing pain creates one of the most confusing dynamics in human relationships. They hurt someone they care about, through emotional unavailability, through words spoken in defensiveness, through actions that communicated indifference when they felt anything but indifference. And then, instead of moving closer to repair the damage, they move further away. To the person they've hurt, this distance looks like callousness, like the avoidant doesn't care about the pain they've caused, like they're prioritizing their own comfort over making amends. But inside the avoidant's psychology, something entirely different is happening. They're drowning in shame so overwhelming that proximity to the person they hurt feels psychologically impossible. They want connection, but the weight of what they've done creates a barrier they cannot cross. The distance isn't indifference. It's self-punishment, paralysis, and a twisted form of protection they're offering to someone they believe deserves better than their continued presence. Understanding this paradox doesn't excuse the avoidance behavior, but it reveals the tragedy of someone who withdraws from what they want most because they cannot tolerate who they've been. The shame is so overwhelming. They cannot face the person they hurt. When an avoidant causes pain to someone they care about, the shame that floods their nervous system is unlike anything most people experience in relational contexts. For someone with secure attachment, hurting a partner might trigger guilt that motivates repair, an uncomfortable but manageable emotion that drives them toward apology and behavior change. But for the avoidant, causing pain activates core wounds around their fundamental inadequacy and unworthiness, transforming what could be reparable guilt into paralyzing, identity-destroying shame. The avoidant doesn't just feel bad about what they did, they feel confirmed in their deepest belief that they are fundamentally damaged and incapable of love. The pain they've caused becomes evidence of what they've always feared, that they destroy what they touch, that their emotional limitations make them toxic to people who care about them, that they were right to keep people at a distance because closeness inevitably leads to them inflicting damage. This shame isn't just about the specific incident. It's about what that incident reveals about who they are as a person. This overwhelming shame makes facing the person they hurt feel psychologically impossible. Looking into the eyes of someone whose pain they caused means confronting their own failure, their own capacity for cruelty, their own inability to be the partner they wish they could be. The avoidant experiences this confrontation as unbearable because it strips away every defense mechanism they use to maintain their fragile self-esteem. They cannot minimize, rationalize, or intellectualize their way out of the evidence of harm they've caused. The avoidance nervous system responds to this shame with the same mechanism it uses for all unbearable emotions: avoidance. Just as they avoid vulnerability, they avoid the person who represents their failure to show up well in a relationship. The distance isn't strategic or manipulative. It's an automatic protective response to stimulus their psychology cannot process. Being near the person they hurt triggers such intense shame that their body literally compels them to create physical and emotional distance. What makes this particularly tragic is that the avoidant often desperately wants to repair the damage, to apologize, to make things right. But the shame creates a barrier between wanting to repair and being able to execute repair. They cannot bring themselves to reach out, because reaching out means acknowledging what they've done, sitting with the other person's pain, and accepting responsibility for their impact. Each of these steps triggers more shame, creating a vicious cycle where the desire for repair is paralyzed by the very emotion that should be motivating it. The avoidant also fears that their presence will cause additional harm. They've just proven themselves capable of hurting someone they care about, and they generalize this incident into a belief that they are inherently harmful. Staying away feels like the most loving thing they can do, protecting someone from further damage by removing the source of damage. This twisted logic makes sense within the avoidant's shame-soaked psychology, even as it creates exactly the abandonment and confusion that compounds the original hurt. Moreover, the shame prevents the avoidant from accurately reading the situation or understanding what the hurt person needs. They assume their presence is unwanted, that the person they hurt is better off without them, that any attempt at contact would be selfish and unwelcome. They project their own self-loathing onto the other person, imagining that person must hate them as much as they hate themselves in this moment. This projection justifies the distance while actually making repair impossible. The avoidant also experiences physical symptoms of shame that reinforce their avoidance. When they think about facing the person they hurt, their body responds with visceral discomfort, chest tightness, nausea, or a heavy feeling that makes even the thought of contact unbearable. This somatic response isn't dramatic or controllable. It's an automatic nervous system reaction that their body has learned to associate with exposure and vulnerability. The physical sensation of shame becomes another barrier between wanting to repair and being able to execute repair, adding a bodily dimension to the psychological paralysis they're experiencing. They're waiting for punishment that matches their internal self-condemnation. The avoidant who has caused pain enters a psychological state where they believe they deserve punishment, rejection, and abandonment. Their internal voice is mercilessly condemning them for their failures, and they expect, even need, the external world to mirror that condemnation. The distance they create is partly an attempt to preempt the punishment they believe is inevitable, protecting themselves from the pain of being rejected by withdrawing first. This expectation of punishment stems from the avoidant's childhood experiences where their needs or emotions were met with rejection, criticism, or emotional abandonment. They learned early that making mistakes or showing imperfection led to withdrawal of love and connection. Now, as adults, when they've clearly made a mistake that hurt someone, their nervous system anticipates the same withdrawal. They're waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the person to finally see them as they really are and leave. The avoidant cannot believe that someone could see them at their worst, having caused pain, having failed to show up emotionally, having revealed their limitations, and still want connection with them. This belief is so entrenched that even when someone explicitly says they want to work through the hurt and maintain the relationship, the avoidant cannot fully believe it. They keep waiting for the real punishment, the inevitable abandonment, the moment when the person realizes the avoidant isn't worth the effort. The distance serves as both preparation for this anticipated rejection and as a test. The avoidant is unconsciously creating space to see if the person will abandon them, confirming their belief that they're not worth fighting for. If the person does pursue, the avoidant might push them away harder, escalating their bad behavior until they finally trigger the abandonment they believe they deserve. If the person doesn't pursue, it confirms what the avoidant already believed, that they're not worthy of being fought for. This psychological state also involves a distorted sense that they need to suffer proportionally to the suffering they caused. The avoidant feels they cannot move toward repair until they've adequately punished themselves through isolation, self-criticism, and the pain of separation. They're serving themselves a sentence in solitary confinement, and reconnection feels premature until they've suffered enough to balance the scales. The problem is that no amount of self-punishment ever feels sufficient, because the shame is about their fundamental inadequacy, not just about the specific harm caused. What the avoidant doesn't understand is that the hurt person isn't looking to punish them. They're looking for acknowledgement, repair, and reconnection. But the avoidant's internal world is so dominated by shame and self-condemnation that they cannot imagine someone responding to their failure with anything other than rejection. They're having a conversation with their critical inner voice rather than with the actual person they hurt. And that inner voice is far more brutal than the hurt person would ever be. They believe their absence is a gift rather than another abandonment. In the avoidant's shame-distorted thinking, withdrawing after causing hurt feels like the most selfless, loving action they can take. They've proven themselves capable of causing pain, and they believe that removing themselves from the situation is protecting the other person from future harm. The distance isn't about self-protection, or at least, that's not how it feels to them in this moment. It feels like sacrifice, like the loving choice of stepping back so someone they care about can heal without the continued presence of the person who wounded them. This logic operates from a deeply painful place of self-negation. The avoidant has concluded that they are net negative in someone's life, that their presence causes more harm than good, that the kindest thing they can do is disappear. They're not considering what the other person actually wants or needs. They're operating from their own judgment that they are fundamentally bad for this person. The absence is meant as a gift, a way of saying, you deserve better than what I can give you. What makes this particularly tragic is that the avoidant is creating the very abandonment that likely caused the original pain. The person was hurt because the avoidant was emotionally unavailable, distant, or unable to show up consistently. And now, in response to that hurt, the avoidant is doing more of the same. Withdrawing, creating distance, being unavailable. They're repeating the pattern while believing they're breaking it, compounding abandonment while thinking they're preventing harm. The avoidant genuinely cannot see that their withdrawal is experienced as another act of harm rather than as protection. In their psychology, staying away means the person can heal, move on, find someone better. They don't grasp that what the hurt person often needs is the avoidant's presence, their acknowledgement, their willingness to sit in the discomfort of what they've done and work through it together. The avoidant's absence feels to them like consideration, but to the hurt person, it feels like the avoidant cared so little that they couldn't even be bothered to try to repair what they broke. This distorted logic also protects the avoidant from having to do the vulnerable work of repair. If they can convince themselves that absence is the loving choice, they don't have to face the terrifying prospect of apologizing, acknowledging their impact, and risking rejection or further evidence of their inadequacy. The gift of absence serves the avoidant's need to avoid uncomfortable emotions while allowing them to maintain a narrative where they're being selfless rather than self-protective. The avoidant also operates from a belief that the hurt person would prefer their absence, that seeing the avoidant would only remind them of the pain and prevent healing. They project their own discomfort with facing what they've done onto the other person, assuming that person must feel the same aversion to contact. They cannot imagine that the hurt person might be waiting for them to show up, to fight through their discomfort, to prove through action that the relationship matters more than their fear of shame. In the avoidant's mind, time and distance will eventually heal what they've broken, and only then, once the hurt has faded and the person has moved on, might it be safe to reconnect. They don't understand that wounds without repair don't heal cleanly. They fester. The hurt person isn't healing in the avoidant's absence. They're experiencing compounded abandonment, wondering why someone who claimed to care couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge the pain they caused. The avoidant's gift of distance is actually a theft of closure, of acknowledgement, of the repair that makes healing possible. They're paralyzed between the desire to reconnect and the fear of causing more harm. Inside the avoidant's psychological experience during this distance, there's a constant, exhausting battle between two powerful forces. One part of them desperately wants to reach out, to apologize, to reconnect with the person they've hurt. They miss this person. They think about them constantly. They want to repair what's broken and return to connection. But another part, usually the louder, more powerful part, is convinced that any attempt at reconnection will only cause additional harm. This paralysis is agonizing for the avoidant, though they rarely show it externally. They might draft texts they never send, rehearse apologies in their mind that never reach their lips, drive to places where they might accidentally encounter the hurt person but turn back before arrival. They're caught in an approach avoidance conflict where both options feel impossible. Staying away means losing someone they care about, but reaching out means risking that they'll hurt this person again, or face rejection that confirms their unworthiness. The avoidant's fear of causing more harm isn't entirely unfounded. They're aware of their patterns, their emotional limitations, their tendency to withdraw when things get too intimate. They've hurt this person once, and they genuinely don't trust themselves not to do it again. Without having done the internal work to understand and change their patterns, they're right to question whether reconnection is wise. But this awareness keeps them frozen, rather than motivating them to do the necessary work to show up differently. What the avoidant doesn't realize is that the paralysis itself is causing harm. Every day they remain distant. Every text they don't send. Every apology they don't offer. All of this creates additional pain for the person waiting to hear from them. The avoidant is so focused on the potential future harm they might cause that they're blind to the actual present harm their absence is creating. They're trying to prevent pain while actively inflicting it. This paralysis also reveals the avoidant's lack of faith in their capacity to change or do better. If they believed they could learn from what happened, could grow, could show up differently next time, the path forward would be clearer. Apologize. Take responsibility. Demonstrate, through action, that they're working on their patterns. But the avoidant's core belief is that they are fundamentally limited, that their emotional unavailability is unchangeable, that they'll inevitably hurt people who get close to them. This belief makes reconnection feel irresponsible. The desire to reconnect is genuine and often intense, but it's overpowered by the avoidance risk assessment system that has kept them safe through years of avoiding vulnerability. Reaching out requires exposing themselves to potential rejection, to having to sit with someone's pain that they caused, to admitting failure and inadequacy. The avoidant wants reconnection, but not at the cost of facing these unbearable emotions. So they remain stuck, wanting what they cannot bring themselves to reach for. The avoidant spends this time in a state of quiet torment that nobody sees. They lie awake at night rehearsing conversations they'll never have, composing apologies they'll never send, imagining reconciliation scenarios that require a courage they cannot summon. They check their phone obsessively, hoping for a message that would give them permission to reach out while simultaneously dreading that message because it would require them to finally face what they've done. They see reminders of the hurt person everywhere, a song, a restaurant, a shared joke, and each reminder is both painful and somehow precious, a connection to someone they've lost through their own actions but cannot bring themselves to fight to reclaim. They need permission and reassurance they cannot ask for. What would break the stalemate and allow the avoidant to close the distance they've created? Often, it's some form of explicit permission or reassurance from the hurt person, a signal that they're still wanted, that repair is possible, that the avoidant won't be rejected if they reach out. But the cruel irony is that the avoidant cannot bring themselves to ask for this reassurance. Asking would require admitting they want reconnection, acknowledging the hurt they caused, and making themselves vulnerable to rejection, all things their shame and fear make psychologically impossible. The avoidant is waiting for the hurt person to make the first move toward repair, to extend an invitation back into connection, to communicate that despite everything, they still want the avoidant in their life. They need to be explicitly told that their presence is desired, that they're forgiven, that the relationship can survive what happened. Without this reassurance, the avoidant remains convinced that any attempt at contact would be unwelcome and would cause further pain. But asking for this reassurance would require the avoidant to be vulnerable in ways they've spent their life avoiding. It would mean admitting that they care deeply, that the distance is painful for them too, that they need something from someone else. The avoidant's entire defensive structure is built around not needing, not asking, not revealing the depth of their attachment. To ask for permission to return would be to admit to all the things they've been denying, that they care, that they're affected by the separation, that they cannot handle this alone. This creates an impossible situation where both people are waiting for the other to make a move. The hurt person believes that if the avoidant truly cared, they would reach out, apologize, and work to repair what they broke. The avoidant believes that if they were truly wanted, the hurt person would reach out to them, signaling that connection is still possible. Both are operating from different relational logic, and neither can see the other's perspective clearly through the fog of pain and misunderstanding. The avoidant also needs reassurance that they won't be shamed or punished for what they did, that the hurt person won't use their vulnerability against them if they do reach out. They need to know that apologizing won't lead to a litany of all their failures, that admitting they want reconnection won't be met with rejection or "I told you so." They need emotional safety to do the vulnerable work of repair, but they cannot communicate this need without first doing the vulnerable work. A catch-22 that keeps them frozen. What the avoidant fails to understand is that the hurt person shouldn't have to extend this invitation. The person who caused harm has the responsibility to initiate repair, to reach out, to take the risk of apologizing even without guarantee of reception. But the avoidance psychology doesn't allow them to see it this way. They genuinely believe that their presence would be unwelcome, that the hurt person has moved on or wants nothing to do with them, that reaching out would be selfish imposition rather than necessary repair. They need explicit counter-evidence to these beliefs, but they cannot bring themselves to create the conditions where that evidence might be offered. The waiting becomes a form of passive hope that absolves the avoidant of having to take action. If the hurt person reaches out first, the avoidant can reconnect without having to be vulnerable, without having to risk rejection, without having to explicitly acknowledge how much they care and how much the distance has cost them. They're hoping for a reconciliation that requires nothing of them, a repair that happens without them having to do the uncomfortable work of repairing. This passive stance keeps them safe from vulnerability, but also keeps them trapped in the very distance that's causing them pain.